a unique presentation. I've seen numerous presentations over the past months, to be very honest, and I've actually given some presentations based on what I've researched. But I think what you've managed to do is give us an incredibly interesting, engaging, and visual and historical and personal overview. In such a short time, you managed to pack in so much content, and it's remarkable. I've learned a number of things today, I must say, that I didn't know earlier. I was not aware that Sarat was considered to be a contagious disease. I was under the impression it was a strictly spiritual condition, and the idea of solitary confinement was something that reflected the spiritual source of that particular condition, which was the ill will towards others, the gossip, the negative speech, and it was a period of introspection for the by Sarat. But you've managed to, I think, excavate, perhaps, unintended, but you managed to bring forth certain texts that I wasn't aware of that suggest there was actually a physical condition, yes, affected by the spiritual root, but nevertheless operational as a physical disease with contagion and so forth, which I found very interesting. Is that a universal view or not at all?
So it's a very interesting, you raise a really fascinating point about the history and the evolution of Sarat. So if I were to ask you, and just answer that thinking, what disease is Sarat, what would you answer?
Right, I'm familiar, but people say leprosy typically.
People say leprosy. How did that evolve? So it evolved because of a mistake in translation. It was lost in translation. The Targum HaShivim, which is the Septuagint, translated the Torah and translated the Sarat as lepros. Lepros is just a Greek word for generic skin disease. It turned out that later in history, there was a specific disease which was called leprosy, and it was called leprosy also because of the etymology of the word lepros means skin disease. And for centuries upon centuries, people identified the biblical tsaras as being leprosy. It is not, but it's strongly intertwined throughout many centuries of rabbinic literature that tsaras is equal to leprosy. Hence, the contagion dimension of the rabbinic authorities discussing it as an infectious disease and as a contagious disease. So it is true in its ideal biblical sense. It really isn't leprosy, but it became historically intertwined with leprosy and became associated not only with the spiritual aspect, but with an actual medical disease as well.
But if I understand correctly, you're saying that the mistaken translation found its way into rabbinic literature and interpretation.
So they keep in mind that the biblical tsaras in its classical sense, where people would know they were getting tsaras, because they committed a sin of evil gossip, and they would have this particular the korban that they would bring, and they go sit outside the community. That existed in the biblical times. Perhaps in those times they may have restricted it to the spiritual and not to the physical. But over the course of time, tsaras became identified with the disease leprosy, and in all these halachic discussions about leprosy, not in the classic sense where they would physically leave the camp or have to bring a korban, but they identified leprosy in these physical disease ways as well.
So just to make sure I understood correctly, the biblical commentaries do any of them suggest that the biblical affliction of Sarat was contagious?
So they allude. It's hard to say. I don't know the answer to that one. That would be a guess.
Because it seemed very much the sources you brought seemed to be saying that, covering the mouth. That was really.
They seem to be interpreting. They seem to be interpreting that there is a contagious element. And the truth is, it's not contradictory, because they contract the disease due to their bad habits, and the disease is a contagious disease.
100%. And by the way, that would explain something very interesting, because all other forms of ritual impurity allowed the person who was impure to spend time in proximity with other people who were afflicted by the same status of spiritual impurity. The only exception, to the best of my knowledge, was the mitzvah, was the person who was afflicted by this particular condition. And it could be that the other conditions didn't manifest in any type of contagious physical condition. It was a spiritual condition of impurity that could be transmitted through touch to someone who was not impure. But this was maybe operated a bit more like a disease. Anyhow, it's as much
Okay.
to be. Let me ask you the following, because I thought you made I really loved the title of your talk, which was fascinating, precedented rather than unprecedented. But what I do want to ask you for a moment is, well, what aspects are unprecedented? What are some of the rabbinic questions that we're dealing with today that were not dealt with in previous times due to the specificity of coronavirus and the modernity of the way in which we are organized and live our lives?
So obviously all the technological issues are all a product of the modern era. Whether you can participate in a minyan through Zoom, whether you can participate in a Passover Seder through Zoom, all those are really obviously products of the 21st century. But the principles of, for example, endangering yourself, the principles of triage with respect to the respirators, these are all old questions which have been asked for many centuries. The interesting Passover, they pushed the limit in terms of some leniencies, again, but extrapolating principally from others. So, for example, psychologically, the psychological impact. So, Rav Schechter said today that whereas listening to music is generally not done during the period of the Sfira, which is a period of community mourning, one today, if they're very stressed or if they're sick and the music is a way of easing their discomfort, he said it would be okay to listen to music. But even that has a precedent. So the Chaim Palachi in the 1800s wrote that gambling is absolutely forbidden. And no one should gamble. However, if you're in times of pandemic, and it would ease your stress to go throw the dice, you'd be permitted to gamble.
So basically, at that time, it eases your mental stress, so you can engage in something that's not under normal circumstances not permissible. I think we would need some very strict rabbinic regulation or parameters to describe precisely what aspects that are otherwise forbidden are allowed because of mental stress. Otherwise, we can have serious extrapolation. You know, Professor, you remind me of a joke of the rabbi, the priest, the imam. They get together. They're trying to blow off some steam and they're gambling, and it's illegal in that part of the world. And the police break in and they come downstairs, and of course, the men of faith got rid of the evidence. And the police officer turns to the imam and says, "Imam, were you gambling?" He turns his eyes heavenward, says, "Allah, forgive me for I'm about to sin." And he tells the officer, "No, sir, I wasn't gambling." He turns to the priest and he says, "Father, were you gambling?" And the priest says, "God, forgive me for I'm about to sin," and says, "No, I wasn't gambling." At this point, he turns to the rabbi. He says, "Rabbi, how about you? Were you gambling?" The rabbi says, "With whom?" So that's actually, Doctor, if you can share with me that the source for that, I find that very interesting.
Actually, so I'm going to share my screen with you for a moment, just to apropos your joke over here. I don't know if I can still share. Maybe I can still share. Share screen. 1 second.
Yeah.
1 second.
Yes, you can.
Okay, great. So I just want to show you this cartoon which someone just sent me.
That's great.
So you have the rabbi and the priest and the probably Protestant minister. Right. Well, so much for this joke. The bar is closed.
That's great. It reminds me of a great one where it's a rabbi, priest, imam walk into a bar. The bartender says, "What is this? Some kind of joke?" Anyhow, but you do bring up a very important point, and I do feel like it's important to mention. You mentioned the Zoom Seder and so forth. And I think one of the major challenges that the rabbinic and Orthodox community is struggling with now is the nature of rabbinic ruling. You said earlier it's happening in real time. I would like to add to that a layer of complexity. It's happening so quickly and by means of social media / WhatsApp that create a lot of confusion and sometimes, unfortunately, misrepresentation of viewpoints because they're quoted out of context or without nuance. And I think one such example was the discussion around Zoom Seders and Zooms on Yomim Tovim, where I believe the vast majority, if not, I would say, virtually unanimous position of mainstream Orthodox rabbis is to forbid use of Zoom on Pesach and Shabbat, even for the sake of a Seder, etc. And yet there was this widespread perception that it was permissible because certain rabbis ruled in favor. And if I dug a little bit into it, maybe you can shed some light that the original ruling that allowed this was very, very narrow and limited to specific cases where the individuals in question, that is to say, the people one was being in touch with, were under extreme emotional and mental distress, borderline even suicidal or potentially at risk. And it was only under those circumstances that they suspended or they allowed the use of these technologies. Perhaps you can weigh in on that for a moment. Not just the question of Zoom, but generally speaking, this particular new challenge of teaching Torah and halacha by way of WhatsApp.
There's no question that the things get blown out of proportion, they get misunderstood, they get misapplied. And you're right, this was literally less than a handful of rabbis who made a very narrow decision. Although other rabbis even disagreed with that narrow decision. The decision itself was narrow, and the whole concept got blown out of proportion. Right. But the concern that you mentioned is really a fundamental concern, not just restricted to the halachic world. The transmission of information, right, and has really impacted the understanding of the individuals about the disease of corona, how it is spread, how it is treated, effective modes of treatment, and there's been such an immense amount, of misinformation about effective treatments and effective vaccines and effective ways of preventing transmission, that I think it has led to emotional distress amongst the community. And that's a major factor, which is still ongoing, by the way. Even, we have the President of the United States taking hydroxychloroquine, who doesn't even have the disease, and the entire medical community said that hydroxychloroquine could be more harmful than helpful. So there's a lot of misinformation, which has led to a lot of tremendous stress across the communities.
I'm going to try to ask a few, with the remaining few short minutes we have, quick sort of rapid fire type of questions. Great. If in fact they could be answered quickly, and I'm not sure.
Sure, I'll give one line, whatever.
Okay, to what degree of risk is a doctor or medical professional obligated to engage in and then permitted to engage in if it's beyond that degree towards which it's obligated?
Right, so there actually is no percentage point on that. So the average person is allowed to engage in standard risky behavior. The physician, so an average person would not necessarily have to walk into a room where there's a patient with corona, but a physician would. But a physician, even when they would do that, they would have to gown up and wear all this so-called PPE, protective equipment. To engage in behavior with high fatality, so for example, to do a resuscitation on an Ebola patient, where fluids are flying around and the Ebola has high fatality, that might be in the category of prohibited. But there's a large category, there's a large gray area where a physician could accept that risk, but is not obligated to accept the risk.
Thank you, that was brilliant. And does that physician need the permission of their family? As you mentioned, they might be bringing it back with them home. They're not just putting themselves under risk, but they're also putting their immediate family in risk, potentially.
So the physician he or she has a right to accept that additional risk for themselves. They do not have the right to impose that risk on others. So if that would entail, so obviously it depends on the circumstance. If it would entail them having to not return home for short periods of time, that might be within the accepted risk which they are and ramifications of that risk. But if they're coming home to a family member that's immunocompromised and they're working with corona patients, that they're not allowed to do. They're not allowed to take that risk and transpose that risk to someone else who doesn't have that same obligation.
Right. I say this somewhat facetiously that not coming home for a period of time carries its own separate risks from the family. But in reality, I'm asking you, the doctors and you and individually and your colleagues and friends, has this affected their personal life, their family life? How has it affected their personal family life, to the best of your knowledge?
The impact has been profound. We are seeing some of it. Some of it will only manifest over the course of time. But the conversations that I have with my colleagues, invariably relate to these kinds of issues. Are you sleeping at home? Are you sleeping in the basement? How are your kids handling the fact that you're not hugging them when you're coming back from work? So in some cases, both the husband and the wife are healthcare providers, and it causes an immense challenge for the children. And obviously varies significantly if the children are relatively young versus adolescent children or older children. These have had profound impact on the social fabric of the family.
What has been the most difficult situation you've been placed into over the past few months as a result of COVID-19?
Honestly, the most difficult decision or position for me was whether I should continue working or not. That was really my challenge. In the hospital, I've encountered many challenging cases of COVID. Unfortunately, loss of life of COVID is a reality. I haven't had any specific cases where there's only been one respirator for two patients. That we are a major facility, but even we could encounter that, but we didn't encounter that. But the greatest fear for me is what I call PTSD, which was pre-traumatic stress disorder. was the possibility, the prospect, going to work every day knowing that I could contract a disease which could kill me, was sometimes even paralyzing. It was just very frightening. The entire room that I work in is filled with COVID patients. There's COVID in the air, it was something which I struggled with. It was probably one of the more. Aside from the actual getting the disease itself, and then in the midst of the disease, the fear of progression of disease was also very frightening. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Someone was sending around a very beautiful comment from some of the earlier Torah sages about how it's not, sometimes the fear surrounding an epidemic is far more destructive than the epidemic itself. And the context was actually medical. It wasn't just psychological, i.e. it was the statistics that were presented in that particular scenario, I forget the details, demonstrated that the larger percentage of fatalities came from the fear surrounding the epidemic than actually the epidemic itself.
Right. So that actually is reflected in one of the sources I mentioned. I didn't highlight it significantly, but the halacha was that you shouldn't sit shiva.
Right.
Why shouldn't you sit shiva? So the Divrei Malkiel said that the reason you shouldn't, and I think it actually applied today also. You shouldn't sit shiva because if you're sitting in a community and you see there's 500 people sitting shiva, you're going to panic because you realize this is a very serious pandemic. And there were newspapers here in New York area that had literally 50 pages of obituaries. And I think in the pre-modern time, interestingly, and maybe somewhat ironically, they were more sensitive to the emotional, psychological dimension as having physical impact than even we are today. And I think that really alludes those.
Yeah, that's such an interesting insight. I believe it's, in certain respects, those who came before us, who we sometimes view as more primitive and less knowledgeable, had access to more basic knowledge and truth, as it were. First of all, because I'm very unclear, and I think many people are unclear about what's actually the reality today. For example, in a country like Israel that locked down and they brought the casualties down dramatically. The statistics are very small. Obviously, every death is a tremendous loss. It's a world entire. That said, what happens now when they open the borders? People start coming from other parts of the world. If even one person brings it in and there's a certain lack, a certain looseness surrounding social distancing, the country could be hit in the same way that other countries were hit, unfortunately. So my question is, how significant, how helpful was lockdown in the future, not in the short term, not in the now? Because we know that it's been an incredibly effective medium. But what about going forward? What are the next things that we have to be careful about? What are we looking into? What about vaccines? What about antibodies? Can one get it again? Things like that. In short, I know it's a big question.
Right, sure. So I'll try and address those point by point, keeping in mind that there still are unclear answers to all of these questions. So, for example, there isn't a single physician across the globe that will guarantee you that if you have antibodies, you will not get this disease, even though, by the dictates of virology, if you've already contracted a disease and you have antibodies, and this is what we've been operating, this is the principles we've been operating by, throughout the last centuries, that you should not, in theory, contract the disease, but they're hedging their bets on that. You are correct. Once we open the floodgates, there's definitely a fear for another surge. I think really we need to cover, and this is the extraordinary times that we live in. We back 200 years ago, the rabbis were debating whether vaccination was halachically permitted, and we have people today, and fast forward to a few hundred years, vaccination is one of the most extraordinary advances in mankind. We now rely on vaccination to save society. We are begging for vaccination, and the truth is that our problem really, this is the luxury of the society that we live in now. We really need to cover ourselves till an effective vaccine is found. That's the period of fear, that there could be a resurgence if you open up the gates again. I do think it won't be as bad. I do think a lot of people, at least here, have contracted it. So the next surge will exist, but probably the blip will be smaller, God willing. But once we get a vaccination and we can cover a majority of the people with vaccine, then I think we can open very safely and not have to worry about the disease. And it'll be like any other disease, just added to the list of diseases we expect to see, like annual flu. Now we'll expect coronavirus as part of the list of diseases we need to put on our differential diagnosis.
Okay, interesting. Two more quick questions. One of them is there some type of formula? I know this is probably one of those gray areas too, where the rabbinic authorities will say, look, there's risk in life. Anytime you cross the street, there's a high level of risk, etc. And so at some point, life must go on. And so we open the synagogues again, and we just get on with it under the social distancing and so forth. What are the parameters? Again, maybe there is a percentage, maybe there isn't, where we say, okay, this much risk we take into consideration when dictating how the Jewish community will continue to practice religiously. And beyond that level of risk, or lower than that threshold, we continue to operate as normal.
A really good question, and it's manifest in an interesting way. I mean, usually we rely on society, what's accepted risky behavior by society, to make a determination. So, driving is an accepted risk, flying is an accepted risk, having people work in building a tunnel or a skyscraper. There hasn't been a single one of those that hasn't led to loss of life. So you could forbid them all because of the small percentage of loss of life. So we have an accepted risk. It's interesting, the government here in New York has allowed synagogues to open with social distancing, but there are a number of rabbis, including the OU and the Rabbinical Council of America, who've extended the closure of synagogues beyond what the government believes. So they are more strict in their assessment of risk even than the government is allowing. Now, of course, these are challenging times, and there's still a lot of misinformation, still a lot of unknowns. So they're being a little more machmir, a little more strict. But I think ultimately we rely on science to help determine that risk for us. And if society considers it an acceptable risk, then we would generally utilize that information to assess our own tolerability.
Now, perhaps the next question is psychological, but from your sense, because you're really on the ground, do you think life will change for people? Do you think synagogue life will change? Do you think social distancing will be part of how synagogues are organized going forward beyond 6 months, beyond a year or two? How quickly do you think people will fall back on the sort of normalization process? This is, I'm saying, if we don't have a vaccine, or until we have a vaccine, rather.
Right. So I think human memory is relatively short. I think in the very short term, there's no question we'll all remember social distancing. We'll all be diligent about social distancing, but to maintain that level of vigilance is challenging, and I'm not sure if it's going to be doable. So that also might end up leading to the resurgence of another blip of the coronavirus in the pre-vaccine upcoming period. Whether that vigilance needs to be persistent, the answer is yes. Whether we need to maintain the social distancing, the answer is a categorical yes. And I hasten to add, those who are at high risk, especially people older or people have certain diseases which would make them at high risk, they need to maintain vigilance no matter what the government says about opening. They need to maintain high vigilance until a vaccine is found. And that includes, unfortunately and challengingly, it includes, opening the doors of their homes to their family members who are now, mixing with the rest of society. The disease hasn't gone away.
Right.
The coronavirus, I'm still seeing coronavirus in the ER, much less, but every day we're still seeing corona patients. And I don't think it's going to go to zero. I think it's going to come down, but I think it's kind of low. So it's a risk which simply isn't worth taking when, at least because it's a short-term risk and we see the possibility of vaccine on the horizon.
Wow. Look, let me wrap up with the story and the final remark. The story is actually one that I think about often in the context of the limitations we now have as far as expressing our religious sentiment and practice in a communal setting, which to date here, at least in this country, remains forbidden and will probably be so sometime into the next few months. This is a story of Rabbi Elimelech and Zusha, brothers, Hasidic masters, who were once falsely accused of a particular crime and thrown into prison. And these prisons were incredibly primitive, of course. And while they were in the room, the time to pray mincha, which of course concludes with nightfall, was coming. And they had very few minutes left to pray. And the Elimelech, one of the brothers, noticed that there was a pail of human waste in middle of the cell, which precludes prayer, because one is only meant to pray in a setting that has the proper, a respectable and respectful setting, and human waste is an impediment to that. And one of the brothers began to cry because he was so pained by the inability to pray mincha, which is something he had done literally every day of his life since he could remember. And while he was crying, his brother turns to him and he says, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "Because I won't be able to pray mincha today." And his brother told him something profound. He said, in the very same way that under normal circumstance you are obligated to pray mincha, and that's how you express your connection and commitment to religious law and God. Now, under these circumstances, which according to the halacha forbid you from praying mincha, will be the way in which you express your dedication and commitment to God. And when he heard this, it created such an exhilarating effect and paradigm shift that he jumped up with joy, and the two brothers began to dance in ecstasy. They had this sort of spiritual moment. And of course, one of the guards, who was particularly cruel, caught sight or sound of this, and he comes to the cell and he hears dancing and joy, which really upset him, of course. And so he asks one of the people in the cell, "What is wrong with these guys? Why are they so happy?" The guy says, "I don't know exactly what made them so happy, but I know that it has something to do with the pail in the middle of the cell." At which point, this guard, who was a pretty nasty fellow, opened the cell, runs right in, grabs the pail, and takes it right out of the cell in order to make a point. At which point, both brothers immediately began to pray mincha. And I love this story because it's so true. It's very difficult, especially as we come to Shavuot in just a few days. We receive the Torah anew, and especially in the Hasidic and Chabad culture, this was a tremendous day to engage the wider community and invite everyone to the synagogue as the Rebbe would teach, because the Torah is given anew each and every year, as it were. There's a new Torah light present this year that wasn't present before, that is literally unprecedented and would not come again. And it's that renewal, that covenantal renewal that we re-experience every year anew. And this year represents its very real challenges to us as a community. And so we will be dancing nonetheless, because this is our form of commitment and connection. And as someone beautifully pointed out, whereas in times bygone, synagogues were closed by our enemies out of hate, today it is we who have closed our synagogues out of the love and compassion, and in order to protect the life of our brothers and sisters. But we do that God will take the pail, remove it from this cell, this virtual cell, so to speak, and here in this country and around the world to re-engage in the beauties and the powerful benefits and blessings of Jewish communal life, of Kehillah, once again very soon. With that note, I would like to thank you, Professor Reichman, for an incredible presentation. As ever, it's such a joy to listen to you. I can sit with you for hours on end because you're so filled with knowledge, information, and you present so smoothly, easily, and enjoyably. But alas, I do recognize that you have other commitments, so I'm going to let you go on that note. But thank you so much again, and thank you everybody for joining for